Hello, everyone. Welcome. Bienvenue. Bonjour. I'll just maybe, pause for a few seconds just to let everybody into this session. In the meantime, I can introduce myself again for those who don't know me. I'm Dr. Kathleen Reddy from the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg. I am one of the organizers of CSECS Midwestern ASECS 2021 with a whole team of organizers. Some I already see who are in the audience this evening. And I'm also with my colleague in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg, Dr. Paul de Pasquale, co-organizer of our special programming on the Indigenous 18th century. It is my very great pleasure to introduce the first of our three conference plenary speakers, Dr. Cary Miller from the University of Manitoba, which, like the University of Winnipeg, is located in Treaty 1 territory and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Dr. Miller is Anishinaabe with ties to the St. Croix, or I guess St. Croix, as many of us would say in Canada, and Leech Lake communities. Before coming to the University of Manitoba in 2017, Dr. Miller was a faculty member for 15 years in the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She is currently the former head, so I was just about to say currently the head, but she is the former head of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. Will be moving into some new roles in the administration, Associate VP Indigenous and Research. Do I have that right, Cary?
Curriculum and Research. Indigenous Curriculum and Research.
Okay, that's right. Curriculum and Research. And then you will also be the Indigenous lead for the Faculty of Arts.
I'm the lead for the interim, and then November 1st, I take on the new role.
Okay. So congratulations on those new appointments. You also, I know, have served additionally on the executive for the Faculty of Arts, and you've been on University Senate. And also during the last 4 years at the University of Manitoba, Dr. Miller has worked to expand Indigenous content across the university curriculum. She's closely involved in the University of Manitoba Summer Institute on literacy in Indigenous content, so a 10-week program for faculty who are interested in introducing Indigenous content into their courses. And it's through her efforts that the university has been able to make an increasing number of Indigenous language courses available to students at the University of Manitoba. As a scholar, Dr. Miller's specializations include Indigenous epistemologies, Indigenous history before 1867, including treaty history, Anishinaabe leadership and diplomacy, and Anishinaabe women's history. In her research and teaching of Indigenous history, Dr. Miller has sought consistently to challenge an understanding of Indigenous history as something separate from American and Canadian history. Her monograph, Ogimog, Anishinaabe Leadership from 1660 to 1845, was published with the University of Nebraska in 2010. This book challenges scholarship that has tended to take primary sources written from the European perspective at face value, and as a result, fundamentally misunderstood the nature of Anishinaabe acephalous leadership. In addition to this monograph, Dr. Miller is the author of many articles and chapters, including in the 2013 collection centering Anishinaabe Studies, Understanding the World Through Stories, published with the University of Manitoba Press. And with Bill Newbegin, Dr. Miller is the co-editor of the 5th edition of the Indigenous People Within Canada, sort of textbook classic that, of course, was originally authored by Olive Patricia Dickinson. I should just say that in asking Dr. Miller to be one of our keynote speakers, we have looked to her ability to speak effectively, not only to the conference theme, but more broadly to Indigenous issues of the long 18th century, to an audience that needs to hear more from someone with deep knowledge of them. Her talk today is Indigenous Agency in the Indigenous 18th Century. Please welcome Dr. Cary Miller.
Thanks very much. I should mention that fifth edition is still forthcoming, so don't run out and look for it just yet. So the Indigenous 18th century, I'm beginning here with the land acknowledgement, with Catherine had already mentioned, in part because one of the things that we're going to hear Indigenous leaders evoke a number of times through the presentation is precisely this, a desire for acknowledgement of their lands. And this starts right away with the very first, voyage of Cartier, when he meets at Stadaconia a leader named Donnacona. And Cartier had engaged in kind of the usual rituals of claiming that we see Europeans engage in. So he raises a cross, he hangs a big shield on it that has embossed the 3 fleur-de-lis of France, the royal family, and has a big sign above it proclaiming "Long live the King of France" in lovely Gothic letters that I'm sure none of the locals could understand. But what the locals could understand, right? And we're in a moment when we have a significant language barrier. I know issues of translation is another theme of this conference. It's very clear that Donnacona recognized exactly what Cartier was about. And Cartier describes, in his subsequent papers, that once this had been raised, Donnacona pointed to the land all about, as if he wished to say, all this region belonged to him, and we ought not to have set up this cross without his permission. So in many ways, in bringing back the land acknowledgements that we do now, I think our ancestors would be pleased to see that acknowledgement that they're speaking from the very first moments of contact being recognized today in a different way than perhaps before. Now, a lot of the work that I do is dealing with, the ways that our histories have been constructed and encouraging people to think about them in a new way. On moving to Canada, I grabbed, a nice set of textbooks. I believe these are actually used at UM. And the first thing that struck me was the titles of the books themselves, right? When we talk about the ways that we construct histories, in many cases, we construct histories as origin stories. So we even have the first half of the textbook called Origins, and the second half called Destinies, right? Destinies assuming a certain preordained or foregone conclusion that could not have gone any other way, that perhaps can't be interpreted in other ways. And so these kinds of conceptualizations of our historical past across North America, in both Canada and the United States, are in many ways acts of erasure, are acts of nationalism that hide and obscure the real histories that would help us understand our present so much more. So this narrative absence is repeated in the images of textbooks, and the images in particular of maps. And this again goes back to our land acknowledgement. These maps are not engaging in land acknowledgement, right? They're showing us European claims, and these are maps, from the 18th century, at which time most of these lands under claim, under these rubrics of French land or British land or Hudson Bay Company land or Spanish territory. These are imagined claims more than they are actual claims, because Indigenous people are living throughout these territories in very large numbers, in numbers certainly that the imperial powers could not challenge collectively as a whole. And I'm going to talk about how much warfare becomes endemic across this century on this continent. And it's a warfare that Indigenous people are not being duped into, are not being pulled into as mercenaries. It is conflicts that Indigenous people are choosing to join or not for their own purposes, often in pursuit of retaining sovereignty and retaining land and preventing expansion, in ways that I think the way we talk about this century and the wars in it often ignore. Okay. And this particular top right map that I show from a US standard textbook, this one is suggesting that unless you have a European claim to the land, it's not even useful to show it. So you have the northwest coast here of the continent completely covered over with text. Why show it? There's no European claim. And that's how erased Indigenous people are, considering the incredible density of settlement along the Pacific Northwest through most of the historical period. So we see a lot of stereotypes and assumptions coming out of both the original sources and the way that we present this history. And I'll talk about some of those sources specifically and the lasting impacts they have on our governing systems and our education. But you have, first of all, the idea that North America was an empty wilderness, a wilderness we need to protect with our national parks, right? One of the facts that I always bring up when I talk about the parks is that in order to create, I believe it's Yosemite National Park, they had to remove 9 Indigenous communities. Everywhere there is a national park, it is a place and a space that was lived in by Indigenous people, where the land was managed in various ways by Indigenous people, where agriculture was engaged in by Indigenous people. And so this notion of an empty wilderness, right? Sort of, I remember being in 6th grade and getting my new US history textbook and opening it up to the middle, where it had endless rolling hills of plains across which were rolling the wagon trains, right? No people in sight. It's empty. And in that erasure, the narrative is fundamentally changed. Okay. So you also will see in, a lot of the texts of the 17th and 18th centuries, sort of depictions, particularly by scholars who have never even been to North America. Well, clearly, this is the Garden of Eden, or clearly, this is the place where we can say the state of nature still exists and point to that of an example of how to explain that. But again, all of those depictions suggest Indigenous people have no governance, suggest that Indigenous people have no fixed place or tie to place, suggest that Indigenous people have very little history, right? So those kinds of depictions with those kinds of catchphrases, or they very much create an entire conception of what people are experiencing as they come to North America. The other piece that is very much carrying over from the development of medieval thought around justifying crusades and crusading is this doctrine, which is pretty set by the time we get to 1492, that non-Christian people do not have legitimate governments or claims to territorial authority. That the only individuals who can have that claim are anointed Christian kings. Okay? And that's enormously important when we realize the sponsor of Columbus's voyage has just completed the Reconquista of Spain, is coming directly from a crusade, has that crusade frame of reference that immediately gets applied to what is encountered in the Caribbean, in Central and South America, where they initially begin to colonize. So out of that, out of those two things, we get this sense that indigenous societies, lacking governance and tied to place, lacking legitimacy, wander aimlessly. And I often point out that how ridiculous that notion is, because the idea of someone engaged in a subsistence economy, where you look out at the woods. I'm right on the living Prairie Museum property, so I have woods right out here. I look out in the woods and I go, I think I'll walk in the woods and see if I find any berries today. Wouldn't that be nice? But I don't know if I'm going to find any. It does not make any sense from the perspective of how are these people surviving? How are these people thriving in the enormous numbers that were here at the time of contact? We knew our territories, we knew where the resources we wanted to access grew, and we engaged in practices that promoted the success of those plants. And I put it that way because oftentimes when we use the word agriculture, we all assume what we see today if we drive out in the countryside, that it's monoculture, that it is in some ways terraformed. There's a lot of discussion about mounds and landforms that were indigenously created that are destroyed to create flat fields for the purpose of agriculture. Indigenous people engaged in what we would call agriculture differently, rather than saying, well, I know that blueberry bushes require sandy soil, so that I'm going to go haul a bunch of sand to this location, mix it in, and then try to grow blueberries. Instead, it's where within the territory that our community has access to and responsibility for, does that sandy soil exist? So the blueberries are already growing there. And what do we need to do to promote that? Well, we need to burn that area over every 5 years with a controlled burn. And so that's the mode of agriculture. There's actually even as late as the 1930s, editorials written by Indigenous people in Wisconsin arguing against the DNR's prohibition of controlled burn of blueberry bushes, precisely because it's going to undercut their economic stability. They say specifically in the article, we can make $800 a summer if we control burn these patches every 5 years. We will only make about $200 to $300 per summer if we are not allowed to do that. So there is a way in which the establishment of parks tied to this myth of the wilderness have really impeded Indigenous continued acts of subsistence, as well as land management. And certainly that's become a conversation as we see more and more forest fires. We also see the sort of very derogative descriptions of Indigenous people as quote unquote savage, of Indigenous people depicted as ignorant and lacking science, as violent, as dirty. And of course, Europe at this point in time, given their bathing practices, arguing that Indigenous people could be dirty is sort of the pot calling the kettle black. There's a wonderful description of a particular chief that every time he came into the French fort would cover his mouth due to the smell. So, the reality of what is actually there is very different from these very negative stereotypes. But I still find, as I go to present around campus about how can we bring more Indigenous knowledge into the classroom, I go to the sciences, and that's something they often put forward. Well, Indigenous people didn't have science. Well, that's not true, right? We certainly engaged in science in a variety of ways, particularly engineering. I've talked with elders who can tell me the heat burning point of the different kinds of woods that they use. They'll say, this is the one you want to use when you're doing sugar bush. This is the one you want to use when you're going to go fast, because you won't need much of it because it's long burning and heats at such a point. So that knowledge of the very specific differences and properties of all the different woods that we have, the function of their barks. When you look at a birch bark canoe, right, which was obviously such amazingly well-suited technology to the environment, that all of the fur trade companies immediately adopted that rather than trying to bring in European shipping technology. It's made of 5 different woods. It's made of the birch bark for the outer hull. Then you have long slats of cedar that are going to expand when they impact moisture, so it prevents leaking, but also redistributes the weight across the canoe, so you're less likely to punch through the birch bark hull. Then you have the pieces that give it that rounded shape, which you bend over a fire to gradually heat the wood and get that bend in it. And you make those out of either ash or more cedar, depending on what you have. You get either spruce root or weegub, the inner bark of a basswood tree, to sew the canoe together, to sew the bark to the frame. And then you seal all of the seams with pitch made from pine sap mixed with ash. And so there is an incredible amount of knowledge, scientific knowledge about these different products, about how to create this piece of technology. And that gets multiplied in so many ways across different disciplines. One of my colleagues who works in Inuit studies was telling me about a documentary where the Inuit were telling them that the sun had moved its location in the sky. And so they were starting to pose that maybe this meant there was a shift in the magnetic poles of the Earth. They gave the data to NASA. NASA came back and said, no, the poles aren't shifting. What it is we have more and more pollution in the air. And that's why it appears that the sun is in a different location, is because of that refraction. And they were like, oh my goodness, how are we going to explain this to the community? So they go back and they're trying to get well, let's see. And the community says, oh, well, I know what that is. That's X. I forget the Inuit word, forgive me. My colleague said, it wasn't a word I'd heard before. So I asked them to explain what it meant. Well, that's when, if you are fishing, spear fishing through a hole in the ice, the fish isn't actually where it's shown by the light. So they understood the properties of light refraction, had words for it in their language, in a way that Europeans simply assumed did not exist. So I mentioned I would talk about some of these thinkers that we still read in our classrooms today. We have a number of these guys that are coming up with justifications for why England can jump into the colonial game. Thomas More in particular develops this concept of vacuum domicilium, or empty land, which is sort of this idea that if you have not put improvements on the land, there is an absence of ownership. Later writers sometimes use a very similar term, terra nullium, to note places where people exist, but because they have not improved the land, then the colonizing force is able to claim that there is actually not a dominion that they are challenging by claiming the land. So then you have Thomas Hobbes suggesting that before there were governments, humans lived in a state of nature, which is a war against all, in which human beings seek to destroy each other in an incessant pursuit of power. Life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. And states further, there are many places where man lives so now, for the savage people in many places of America have no government at all and live this day in this brutish manner. Which again, could not be farther from the truth. This is somebody who has not been to North America, but yet when we still assign Hobbes' Leviathan, do we as instructors and teachers take the time to challenge these assumptions that are being put forward in his work, or are we allowing them to simply move forward without that challenge? So similarly, John Locke, the second treatise on government, again, asserting this natural law. In the beginning, all the world was America. John Locke perhaps had a little bit more experience. He served as the secretary to the Lords Proprietors of Carolina, but at the same time is very, very invested in this idea that Indigenous people do not utilize land in the same way. So how are Indigenous people engaging? When we talk about the Indigenous 18th century, we're talking about, on the one hand, the fur trade, a fur trade that does not exist without the pre-existing trade routes north, south, east, west across this continent, and the agricultural productivity of Indigenous people, right? Because, while you might have a place like, I believe it's Fort William that's over by Thunder Bay, where they have a very small farm there with a couple of goats and maybe a cow here and there. That's so the couple guys at the top can have butter. All of the folks going out on all of these routes deep into Indigenous lands, are they benefiting from any of that, quaint farm butter, milk? No. They are subsisting at the sufferance of Indigenous people who are selling them excess produce that they were already in the practice of producing for the trade on this continent before fur traders arrived. Further, one of the other things that traders absolutely notice is that Indigenous people have preferences for specific goods. These preferences then impact and influence European manufacturing. In particular, we're going to talk about the degree to which fabric becomes an enormously important and desired product and really plays a role in spurring the fabric industry in England. Diplomacy and trade throughout this century are still conducted according to Indigenous rules and protocols. And in general, we can look at both governing documents from New France and from the various colonies that make up New England, and we can flat out see all of them want to impose European rules and want to impose European law. They are not able to do so because Indigenous people refuse to engage on those grounds. I'll have a slide later with some quotes that show, they say literally, if we're going to be allies, you have to engage according to the rules that we've put forward. And scholars like Richard White have done an amazing job of documenting that diplomacy. But the bottom line is Indigenous people across this century still have the power to force Europeans to engage according to those rules. The choices and actions of Indigenous leaders will shape the history of North America and hold the fate of present and future nations in their hands. And this goes further than being an assertion of Indigenous agency to really looking at the common goals and interests that we already saw when we talked about land acknowledgements. Indigenous people are choosing strategies to ally or not ally, to join as a military force with a European power or not, according to whether it's going to meet their goals, not the goals of these various Europeans. So I wanted to put up some maps that show the extent of these trade routes. I talked about the birch bark canoe. It's not the only watercraft that is devised by people in the Americas. We have on the Pacific coast enormous dugout canoes from the very old growth cedar trees that carry 18, 20 people and are able to sail on ocean waters. They're able to be rowed on ocean waters. But the bottom line is, we are not isolated from one another. We are constantly in communication. So that's another thing that we, I think, often forget. If we see the British talking with the Iroquois are not keeping to themselves many of the things that they're hearing about. They're talking to the Delaware, they're talking to the Cherokee, they're sharing this knowledge. And we see, various individuals talk about, oh my goodness, I'm out here as this lowly missionary and they're passing wampum belts. They are communicating and making their own plans in very, looking towards confederacies even before I think we often acknowledge them. And that's something else I'm going to raise. We often talk about confederacies kind of, oh, all of a sudden here's Pontiac and we see confederacies and then Tecumseh. But I'm going to talk about how these confederacies really predate that and are a much more consistent feature across the 18th century. So Alexander Henry in 1760, as he was going out to engage in and form trade relationships with the British after the French had left, talks about reaching Lake of the Woods. And at Lake of the Woods, he talks first about engaging in trade with the hunters. But then after that, the hunters step back and he talks about trading with the women of the community. A trade was open, the women bartering rice. Before morning, I had purchased 100 bags of nearly a bushel measure each. Without a large quantity of rice, the voyage could not have been prosecuted to its completion. The canoes, as I have already observed, are not large enough to carry provisions, leaving merchandise, as in leaving merchandise behind, being wholly out of the question, right? So, and I found that very interesting. When I actually stopped at Fort William Historical Park, the guides there, the docents there had no idea what I was talking about with the importance of rice to the conduct of the trade. And yet we see in the competition between the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, discussion among the traders about, all right, we've got to try and beat the other company out here to buy up all the available rice. Because if you get starved, if you are not there in time to buy up the excess rice, you are going to be hungry this year. And some of the journals of the XY folks talk about in the very first years of the 19th century, very starvation conditions because they didn't get there in time to buy the rice. So, so this is enormously important, and it means that scholars like Bruce White have identified as much as a third of the transactions that we see in fur trade journals are transactions engaged with women, because women through most of indigenous North America are the farmers. They are growing the corn, they are harvesting rice, they are harvesting maple sugar. And in part, the times of the year that they would engage in these practices are also the times of the year, in particular the spring and the fall, when there are fish runs. And so the men go to the fish runs, they catch the fish, and engage in processes of drying that, while the women are engaged in this more agricultural labor. The important thing to understand, and that certainly our European traders really struggled with, is because these were products of women's labor, women owned them. So, when I talked about the importance of fabric, needles, scissors, these are things that women were very interested in obtaining. And they had to make sure that those products were available. And I mentioned here a study that demonstrates between 1715 and 1760, about 60 to 70% of goods purchased for trade at Western forts were basically these kinds of products, were fabrics. Whereas firearms, which, oftentimes it's all like, wow, we must be trading first for firearms. It's all about the firearms. Less than 5% of the goods shipped west in those years. So, understanding what the trade really is. Yes, there is a desire for the beaver pelts, and that is what's getting the money back home. That's what's driving people to want to form these companies in the first place. But in order to operate these companies, you have to feed the men, and you have to have the products that are going to be of interest to those who can sell the food. There's a wonderful exchange in XY Journal where a woman comes in and she's got a significant amount of wild rice that she's willing to sell. And the trader says, great, that's fantastic. I'm really excited to set this over towards your husband's debt. Have a nice day. And she says, oh, no, you ain't. I have not handed you this rice yet. This is my rice. I don't know what arrangement you have with my husband. That's not my business. If you want this rice, you're going to give me that 5-point blanket, and that's how this works. And so we see the fur traders, part of the reason we see women showing up in these records is precisely because of the frustration the fur traders show towards women who are insisting on their right to act as independent economic agents. So I've been talking about the agriculture. I wanted to show you a couple of images. The one here on the right side is from Susan Sleeper Smith's book, Indian Women and French Men. And this is looking at sort of the size of fields that have been identified through archaeological surveys. And here, these are in Lower Michigan. They're using raised bed agriculture. This is very similar to what would have been done in Southern Ontario by many of the same people that are occupying Lower Michigan, right? Because this is the other point. Our nations are transborder. And there are so many of the maps or discussions that sort of stop at the border when that's not where Indigenous trade is stopping. That's not where Indigenous intermarriage, diplomacy, alliances, news networks are ending. And so this is definitely characteristic of a wider area. And in these fields, we would plant according to polyculture instead of monoculture. Okay, so here, instead of doing what our farmers do today, where they alternate soybeans with corn because what one takes from the soil, the other returns, we would plant the corn with bean seeds around it, so that as the corn grew, the beans would use the corn stalk itself as the trellis to grow up, and they are interacting directly in that chemical exchange without having to rotate the crops annually. Then in those low places, kind of at the very edge of these raised beds, you would put the squash plants. The squash plants have huge leaves that create a lot of shade that would keep moisture in these lower areas and help with the overall sort of irrigation, water retention of these fields to increase their productivity. The other thing I often point out to people is that Indigenous people knew their environments very well and took advantage of what we call today microclimates. Catherine had mentioned, I used to live right on Lake Michigan. Any of you that live on the Great Lakes, you hear sort of two weather reports. You hear, this is the temperature on the lake, and then, but on the other side of the city, there's like a 5 to 10 degree temperature difference. So that's the effect of microclimates. That's the effect of the Great Lakes basically moderating the temperature. It keeps the land around it from freezing as fast, and so you get a longer growing period. So over here on the left on this slide, this is actually a missionary drawing of a community in Fond du Lac, Minnesota, where you can see they've identified the Indian gardens on this island in the middle of the river. So it's benefiting from that water effect to extend the growing season. Corn requires 90 frost-free days to grow. It does as you move up into Manitoba, what's today Manitoba and northern Ontario. It struggles. But if you have a microclimate, the chances of having that crop get all the way to maturity is much higher. And it's a great balance with the wild rice. In a river like this, you would probably have some wild rice sloughs along some of the edges of the river, particularly those that are a little bit more sheltered. The wild rice is very strongly affected by water levels. If you have high floods in the spring, it will have trouble germinating. If you have drought at the end of summer, the stalks will become top heavy and fall over. And there are examples where Indigenous people come to the fur trade post or the missionary house in June, and they say, hey, we want to warn you, there's not going to be rice this year. They already know, even though the rice harvest is usually September, because of the water levels, because they're constantly watching the progress of those crops over the course of the summer, they're able to immediately go and say, we're not going to have rice to sell you this year. We advise you to keep more of your people close to the post. We advise you to heavily use the fishing runs this year. And sharing that information about their projected understanding of what the agricultural outcome is going to be. So, Indigenous people are heavily engaged in agriculture, in trading of that agriculture, and moving forward. All right, so I said we were going to primarily talk about diplomacy. And one of the things that probably most of you are aware of is just how consistently European wars are fought in North America over what Catherine has described as the long century. So, maybe starting with the Iroquois and Morning Wars is a little early, but certainly as we get into Metacom's War, King William's War, the War of Spanish Succession, and going all the way up into the War of 1812, you can see where this warfare is constant, where there is rarely a 10 to 15 period without a major conflict. And of course, we're not showing some of the ongoing skirmishes with squatters who are overstepping territorial boundaries. So warfare is a very constant reality of life through this century. And while that does at times bring some instability to Indigenous communities, it also puts Indigenous communities at the center of strategic decisions that affect international outcomes. And they make those choices and they choose those actions for Indigenous reasons. So, when we look at, some of the stereotypes that we have, the French were good to Indigenous people and the British weren't, right? That's our takeaway. Rather than understanding that the Indigenous people had a very nuanced understanding of what was going on and a nuanced understanding over time of, are these guys really a good ally to have? So 1701 is often described as kind of the heyday or the moment of greatest influence and strength for France among its allies, because it's able to negotiate the Peace of Montreal to settle or bring peace to a conflict between the Iroquois and the all of the allies that together Algonquin-speaking nations. We often call them a sort of Algonquin or a greater Algonquin confederacy. Negotiating a peace between these two sides that had been at war prior to when England and France even showed up is a big deal, and certainly is very valued by Indigenous people. One of the things when we talk about trade, trade cannot be separated from alliance. And that's because whenever you engage in alliance, you are exchanging gifts, and you are exchanging gifts to demonstrate that your words are not empty, that you really do care enough about the well-being of the community that you're aligned to provide blankets so they stay warm in the winter, to provide tobacco for their pipes, right? So there's a sense in which, and when you give these gifts, or even if you're exchanging at the post, there's a sense that there's not a set value to goods. The French eventually deal with this by creating the bon marché, which if you want to learn more about, I again refer you to the Middle Ground by Richard White. But it's this sense that an item's value is driven by the degree to which it strengthens a relationship, rather than whether it's made of gold or copper or has any kind of a set value. When I talk to my students about this, I say, well, after class, you can go out in the hall and there will be some soda machines, and you can buy a bottle of Dasani water and it will cost you about $2.50 Canadian. And then you can walk away from that machine. You never have to encounter that machine again. There's no relationship between you and the machine. You have spent your $2.50 and you've gotten a thing of equivalent value. You're done. But if you're here in August and doing your orientation and it's over 40 degrees and you've just been taken on your 1 hour walking tour of the campus with few trees in the beating sun, and you're walking back to the student union, you cannot wait to sit down. You are sweating profusely. And out in front of the student union are a bunch of folks in University of Manitoba shirts with big coolers, and they're pulling out of those coolers bottles of water. And those bottles of water have been sitting in the ice. And so the condensation, when they raise them up in the humid August air, glistens on the bottle. What is the value of that bottle of water to you in that moment? Is it only worth $2.50? Do you feel like the university cares about you because it has put people out here with these bottles at the moment that you need them? Right? So for the trade, we often call it a trade. We often talk about it in very Western economic terms. But for Indigenous people, this is part and parcel of establishing alliance, of maintaining alliance. And in our communities, even today, you are wealthy because of your relationships. An elder in a meeting I was in just a week or two ago commented that she now has 12 grandchildren, which in a traditional way makes her wealthy. It is the relationships that you establish through alliance, through family, through trade, that create the wealth. It is not personal accumulation. So what happens is, over the course of all of these conflicts in the 18th century, most of which the British like to throw blockades along the St. Lawrence Seaway and New Orleans and places where the French are bringing their goods into the interior, it becomes increasingly more difficult for the French to engage in gift exchange. Plus, over the course of this century, the French, even in France, are becoming more and more insistent on their autocratic noble rights. And so we see governors coming in with more of an intent to tell these Indians what they should be doing. The more they tell Indigenous people what they should be doing, the less Indigenous people feel like allies and the more they choose different courses. Further during this century, as Brent Rushford has described in his work, New France begins to engage in a significant amount of Indigenous slavery. When we look at the Fox Wars, for example, from 1711 to I think it's 1736, there is a significant practice of both the French soldiers claiming part of the war captives to take back with them, and purchase of war captives from the Indigenous allies engaged in this conflict. Those individuals are being sold in New France, particularly in Montreal and Quebec. There are descriptions of the French governors being served by these folks. There are Rushford documents. You know, even though in the official communications with the King of France, they're saying, well, of course, when we make peace, we return the war captives, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And the king is saying, good, then you are following what I have told you, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. The return of captives is token. It'll be like 12 out of, you know, however many hundred are taken. There are some major conflicts during the Fox Wars within which whole towns are seized. With you know, what's described as more than 1,000 people that may have at that point been shuffled into an Indigenous trade. And Brent Rushford has looked at not the official communications from New France, but at the court records, at you know, the records documenting inheritance, to show that no, actually, there really was Indigenous slavery. Now, if you are one of the allies and you have just seen France turn on a former ally, even the official documents describe the French governors as being willing to engage in a war of extirpation, of eliminating the Fox as a nation. And above and beyond that, they're enslaving them and keeping them even during times of peace. Do these guys look like a great ally to you anymore? Right? And since the French are holding their trade fairs in Montreal, are holding them in Quebec, these Indigenous leaders who are engaged in the trade, who are setting the bon marché, are going and they are seeing these people. And there's I think Rushford also says every single speech presented to the French hierarchy from the Fox Wars on starts with, and we would like you to return our captives. So all of these pieces are playing into why Indigenous communities end up, by the time we get to the 7 Years' War, deciding to abandon the French cause. It's not one moment. It's not, you know, a sort of, I don't know, they gave us better gifts. No, it is a long observation of inappropriate alliance behavior on the part of the French in this century. So, and I put in here another quote from one of the Indigenous leaders, you know, at a diplomatic gathering. We have great reason to believe you intend to drive us away and settle the country, or else why do you come to fight in the land that God has given us? Why don't you and the French fight in the old country and on the sea? Why do you come to fight on our land? This makes everybody believe you want to take the land from us by force and settle it. And notice in that quote, they're not just saying it's all you British people that are bad. They're saying you and the French. They're seeing a common negative side to the presence of these colonial powers. Does that mean that you cut off your alliance? No, because as long as the other power is there, you still need some access to certain goods. But the overall point of, we're aware that you're here to take our stuff. We think it's inappropriate that your fights about your crowns are happening here. Those are definitely discussions that are taking place in communities and council houses across Eastern North America during this period. So when we look at what some of the indigenous motivations are, I've talked about Europeans being drawn into indigenous conflicts for indigenous reasons. Really, on that first one, I should have included the initial warfare between the Iroquois and the Algonquian nations, but also the Fox Wars where following the Great Peace of Montreal, when they established the fort at Detroit, the French invite a number of their close allies among the Three Fires to settle around that fort. Part of what sparks the Fox Wars is the Fox say, hey, actually, we had been living here before the Iroquois forced us out. Now that there's peace, we should be the ones deciding who gets to settle in this territory. And the French say, well, how dare you think that you get to make that choice? The folks that have moved into that territory are willing to support them. And that begins sparking that war, the 7 Years' War. This is a conflict in which I'm going to talk a little bit later about the land avarice of many of the American founding fathers and the degree to which across this century they engage in land speculation and in particular, land speculations regarding lands that after 1763 are prohibited to them by the line of proclamation, right? Those are indigenous territories. Only the crown can negotiate for those territories. You colonies don't get to go in and muck about with our Indian policy, essentially. But the 7 Years' War, right? The sort of first shots fired is by a young George Washington, who is going in with a surveying party into this region of Pennsylvania that they feel that they have acquired. And they have an Iroquois guide who perhaps, I shouldn't even say perhaps, many scholars now think knowingly, led Washington's crew over to Fort Duquesne, where they would run into a foraging party by the French and kind of reignite hostilities. Now, what this individual's interest in that is less clear. He's one of the Iroquoian leaders. Was this something that the whole Great Council of all Six Nations had agreed on? Hard to say. Is this simply a personal desire to reignite hostilities because of family mourning obligations? That's another possibility. Or is it simply, as long as the French and the English are fighting each other, we can keep them out of our lands and we lie between them, which is another possibility. But in any case, the fact that this is perhaps one of the first conflicts that Britain is heavily pulled into as a result of things that happen in North America, not that North America is an ancillary battleground for important events in Europe. And the degree to which the treasury is drained by that conflict leads England to say, y'all are getting uppity. Y'all are instigating these conflicts with indigenous people. So we're going to tax you for it. And then that gets into the reason that we have an American Revolution. So grievances around that, grievances around not being allowed to expand into indigenous territory because of indigenous negotiated agreements play heavily into why a United States exists. Indigenous people form confederacies against European encroachment. I mentioned that I was going to sort of talk about these in their earlier iterations. Already Metacomet's War, also known as King Philip's War in 1676, is a confederated response to English presence in North America. It's considered one of the most demographically damaging conflicts that's held in North America. Because there's a loss of over 10% of the English population as a result of this conflict. The indigenous population suffers a much greater loss. We estimate around 7,000 people. That's including at least 1,500 that we know the British sold into slavery in the Caribbean. There are families on Haiti that still claim descent from Metacomet. But the bottom line is, right, from a British Crown perspective, these colonists keep pulling us into these very expensive and damaging wars with Indigenous people due to their land and expansion avarice. So Metacomet's war is kind of the first place we see that, and we also are seeing Indigenous confederacies form. Another thing that would have been concerning to the Crown is that this expansionism is creating larger and larger groups of Indigenous people pushing back. And Metacom came very close to being successful. He had hoped to recruit the Iroquois to join him in a war to literally get rid of the English, to push them back into the sea. And it was the decision of the Iroquois to instead attack their usual enemies, the Wampanoag and Narragansett, that made up Metacom's army, rather than join them, that it makes this a decisive loss for them. If the Iroquois nations had joined King Philip's or Metacom's conflict, this might have had a very different outcome for the British colonies in North America. At the same time as that conflict, you have the Wabanaki Wars. The Wabanaki are another people that, like the Iroquois, are between the French and the English. And one of the ways that the Wabanaki Wars have really shaped our country's boundaries, literally, is that they prevent northward British expansion. They engage in a war that's nearly 70 years long. They absolutely sort of have created a situation in which Maine is not one of the original colonies. It cannot be settled because they are making sure that their lands are not engaged in. The Wabanaki are also pulling in a coalition. They're pulling in the Penobscot. They're pulling in a lot of the other nations around them. And again, it's drawing that territorial line in the sand. When we get to Pontiac, when we get to Tecumseh, when we talk about the Northwest Alliance, the line in the sand that they often try to draw is the Ohio River. And we'll talk about that in a bit. The Natchez-Chickasaw Wars. The French had been raiding the Natchez mercilessly, again, perhaps for slaves. The Natchez were taken in by the Chickasaw. It creates a conflict that the French, again, try to extirpate the Chickasaw, with actually a much worse outcome for the French than their Fox Wars. They have two failed invasions, essentially, of the Chickasaw Nation. The Chickasaw still brag about this fairly consistently. In any case, I'm realizing that, like usual, I'm telling too many stories and not moving through this quickly enough. So let's talk a little bit about diplomatic agreements and then get to the point that I want to make here. So I've got a quote here about the Chura Wampum. We shall call each other brother, as we are equal. In one canoe is our way of life, laws, and people. In the other is your ship with your laws, religion, and people. Our vessels will travel side by side down the river of life, and each will respect the way of the other without interference. So this is the first agreement between the Iroquois and the English, and it is very much a treaty, an agreement of alliance with non-interference. I also put up here the first sort of Western style treaty. This is from the Peace of Montreal. And far from the kind of stereotype that illiterate people are writing an X, you can see from this image that each Indigenous leader has a symbol that represents their name. And this would have been true throughout Indigenous communities. These images would be marked on a lodge. It would be marked on the kind of sheds where we stored our sugar making implements over the year until we came back to sugar bush. So using these kinds of symbols as a marking of identity predated these kinds of treaties and kind of, gives the lie to this movie stereotype of everybody marking with an X. We know these leaders, we know their names, which are written very carefully under their symbols. And it's a massive agreement when we talk about why this was a period in which Indigenous people really respected French authority. The French brought 40 nations together to sign that agreement before then really abdicating the strong ground that they had created. So one of the big agreements that Indigenous people in this region have among themselves is called the dish with one spoon. And the notion of this in terms of developing this alliance, that's really the lake nations, which we might call the three fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, who are all around Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and Lake Superior, but also these Ohio nations that, the Shawnee, the Delaware, that are also Algonquin-speaking peoples. They enter into this agreement of the dish with one spoon. And the imagery of that is, this land on which we live feeds us all. And so this land is like a dish with one spoon. And what that means is, as they will increasingly sort of state to imperial colonial authorities, is you have to have the signatures of all of us in order for land to be sold. You cannot go to one chief, you cannot go to one group, unless it is signed by everyone here. It is not a recognized land transfer, because we all eat from the same dish with one spoon. And the metaphor of that diplomatic language is so lasting and important that we even see it as late as the 1825 Treaty of Prairie du Chien, at which, again, was one of these gatherings with 10,000 at least Indigenous people from tribes throughout the Great Lakes region. So the Treaty of Easton, I think fewer people have tied the Treaty of Easton as directly to the Royal Proclamation as I would like to. The Treaty of Easton is actually the result of a negotiation that takes several years. This is the treaty in which the British convince allies that had been supporting the French throughout Ohio and Pennsylvania to no longer support the French. They do not ask them to support the English, but they do ask them to allow the English supply lines through, so that they can attack French forts like the one, like Fort Duquesne, for example. So they tell the English in no uncertain terms how they must conduct a diplomacy to get this agreement. Brethren, we let you know that the French have used our people kindly in every respect, have used them like gentlemen, so they have treated the chiefs. Now we desire you to be strong. With you, we would like the same method and use our people well, for the other Indians will look upon us. In other words, other nations are watching, and we do not otherwise know how to convince them and bring them to the English interest without using such means as will convince them. This is very clearly a statement of, so you've got to engage in our methods of diplomacy according to our protocols and our rules. And the main thing that they request at the Treaty of Easton, as articulated by a number of the Delaware chiefs, is the British were to go back over the mountains, to repudiate some of the Western purchases in Pennsylvania colony, but that go back over the mountain, that's referring to the Appalachian Mountains. The line that becomes the line of the Royal Proclamation, west of which is recognized as Indian territory. So the first time we have Indigenous people articulating that's the line that we would like to have is not Pontiac, it's here in the Treaty of Easton. So again, since I'm a little over running long, I'm going to skip some of our quotes here. But then that takes us right to the conclusion of the 7 Years' War. Amherst basically crumples up the Treaty of Easton, throws it in a garbage can, and starts imposing British rule, inviting British settlers. And the result of that is these collective groups that had come together and signed that treaty engage in what's come to be known as Pontiac's War, right? So, and I love this map because it has the little flames at all the little forts that they destroyed. It warms my Indigenous little heart. But it's incredibly successful in a very short period of time, right? You have 8 forts fall in the Western Great Lakes. And you can imagine the degree to which that made the the British Crown sit up and take notice. Wait a second, there's 2 things going on here. They're destroying our access to trade, and they're also making a very strong statement of this is Indigenous land. Okay. Now, some people have said, well, this is all those French people that didn't move out, stoking up Indigenous people. I don't really think, there may be a piece of that, but Indigenous people are already expressing, we want that Appalachian line as the boundary line in the Treaty of Easton. They're already coming together collectively before that. And so to the extent that the French habitants, the French settlers that stayed might have had an influence, it was only sort of in going in the direction Indigenous communities were already driving the boat. So that brings us then to the Royal Proclamation, which reserves Western land for the several nations or tribes of Indians under protection as hunting grounds, with King George claiming dominion over the entire region with the exclusive right of purchase alone, prohibiting individuals from directly buying Indigenous land. And further, from a American colonist perspective, add insult to injury with the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act was something that certainly those French habitants wanted. The extent to which Indigenous people were pushing for this, at the very least, they definitely wanted that Ohio River boundary that appears at the bottom of this map. And they're recognizing that some of these colonies are claiming to have charters that go through that territory, which, if this becomes part of a new province of Quebec, will no longer, that will end the supposed claims of these eastern colonies, and certainly will end any unofficial treaties. Hey, I got these 3 guys to sign this piece of paper that says I get a piece of Ohio, and therefore, no, that ends that because it's part of Quebec. The Virginians have to go and find something else to do with their time. Now, the Virginians have been spending a lot of their time investing a lot of their money in land futures, land speculation, and in particular, even before that line of proclamation is established, right? I put up here the dates of the Ohio Company. The Ohio Company is established as early as 1748, right? And it folds in 1767 as a result of the king refusing to reauthorize the patents due to the Royal Proclamation. Who's invested? George Washington and his brother Lawrence, Thomas Lee, the Mercer family, James Madison, John Marshall, James Monroe, Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, Thomas Jefferson. Anybody who has studied early American history, these names ought to be on your Rolodex. They ought to be right at your fingertips. So when we think about what is it about the American Revolution that makes it a successful insurrection, you have the interests of the wealthy aligning with the interests of the poor. The poor want to expand west. They want their opportunity to have the quote unquote American dream, just like previous settlers. And the wealthy have already invested their money in those lands that they want to sell to those settlers. So there's a collective economic interest that unites the wealthy and the poor, insurrection against Great Britain. That's not to detract from all of the other reasons. I am going to, though, highlight in the Declaration of Independence the specific items that are talking about the Royal Proclamation, okay? He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, referring to the king, and talks about immigration, but also raising the conditions for the new appropriation of lands. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. Within the Quebec Act, the right to rule according to French common law rather than English common law was given to that province. So they're referring here, I think, to that Quebec Act, and for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province. So again, the Quebec Act, establishing an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same rule to these colonies. And then, remember, with the line of proclamation, one of the things that the Crown agreed upon with Indigenous people to the West is, yeah, if settlers come and settle in those lands, they are there illegally and you can evict them. So, says the Declaration, the Crown has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. Now, certainly impressment is also in the Declaration. That can be viewed as a part of this statement, but it's also in any white settlers, any English settlers going beyond those mountains is outside of the Crown's protection by virtue of the Royal Proclamation. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is all kinds of racist bullshit. So, excuse my language in that. But the point being, again, right, these issues of expansion and the rights that the Crown has recognized for Indigenous people are significant issues of complaint for the elites that are leading this revolution. So following the revolution, one of the first things that President Washington is interested in doing is acquiring and gaining access to the lands in the Ohio that his family has invested in, both for his own personal finances, but also because he kind of went ahead and promised that land to people that signed up for the colonial army and they want it now. So twofold. The Northwest Alliance is going to prove amazingly resilient because the American government is going to go and try and negotiate in the 1780s a number of treaties that say, hi, we conquered you all your land is ours. The Northwest Alliance says, no, it ain't. And Harmar tries to go in 1791 and is defeated. St. Clair follows him with twice as many men. Harmar had maybe 1,000. St. Clair had, we think, closer to 2,000. 24 of St. Clair's men come home without injury. It's a massive defeat of what was at that point a quarter of the army of the United States. Washington is actually brought before the Senate for hearings to explain how he screwed this up so badly, which again, never shows up in our books that often. We just hear about cherry trees. And it's not until 5 years of negotiation allow the United States to build up a 5,000-man invasion force under Anthony Wayne that he's able to go in and defeat the Northwest Alliance at Fallen Timbers. From the Indigenous side, oral tradition suggests that this may be because Little Turtle, who had been the sort of strategist in the first two victories, was not present at Fallen Timbers for one reason or another. But that then starts to put a break as about 2/3 of Ohio are ceded in the Treaty of Greenville that ends the hostilities from Fallen Timbers. Okay. So this takes us then up to Tecumseh and Tecumseh's Confederacy. We can see Tecumseh's Confederacy remains that coalition of people in the Great Lakes. And this map, the best one I could find to show his Confederacy, is still inappropriately using the Canadian border, because we have lots of Indigenous people who are still living on Manitoulin Island, who are in northern Ontario, even some in this peninsula who are also part of Tecumseh's Confederacy. Okay. Tecumseh is able to bring a very broad coalition. I'd mentioned earlier the Natchez Chickasaw conflict with the French. So you already have coalitions that are forming here. Tecumseh apparently had some familial ties with the Creek Nation that allowed him to speak among the Creek. That leads to the Red Stick Revolt. So this is a huge confederacy that had established itself in opposition to the United States. And it's, you know, in many ways, that confederacy and the men that they mustered prove incredibly helpful to the British until the British begin to misuse it. They bring in a general who doesn't understand the wealth of this alliance and kind of squanders it. So we end up after this with a draw. The United States, really begins after this conflict to move into this Great Lakes area. But as I mentioned, as late as 1825, we still have that dish with one spoon language used. So Indigenous people have been very active in forging for their best interests. If Indigenous people were the aimless wanderers, the non-agricultural people who had no governance, folks would have been to the Mississippi River a century or two before this. There is a very concerted effort over 100 years, more than 100 years, to maintain the integrity of the Western Great Lakes and the Mississippi watershed that took enormous number of conflicts in order to break down and move beyond. So when we talk about land acknowledgements, Indigenous people have been demanding the acknowledgement of their land for centuries. And they absolutely shaped the outcomes of these conflicts from the French loss, on into the future. And a number of Indigenous people, particularly from Michigan, will actually move into Canada and be welcomed at the end of that conflict as a buffer against further American incursions. So I will kind of wrap up there, having left, I guess, like no time for questions, but I will give time for questions if people are willing to hang around and ask them. Thank you for letting me be so long-winded, and I hope that this was a helpful conversation. If you have questions, go ahead and pop them into chat or raise your hand.
Just while we're waiting, I just wanted to say thank you, Cary, for such a rich, wide-ranging and suggestive talk. It really, you covered so much ground. It was absolutely breathtaking sometimes.
You know, yeah. It's that editing a textbook thing. I have the big picture in my head right now.
Yeah, the sweep. So is it easier for you to see if you go out of the PowerPoint?
Yeah, why don't I do that?
Yeah.
Stop share. So I'm seeing some thank yous come up in the chat, but I haven't seen any questions or hands raised. Maybe people are dying to go eat. I'm not sure.
So Cary, while we're maybe waiting for someone else to ask a question, I was just so intrigued by what you said about Indigenous women and their kind of power as individual economic agents in the 18th century. And I'd just be interested to hear you expand a little bit more on that particularly.
Well, I'm really going to recommend you to take a look at some of the work that Susan Sleeper Smith has done. I mentioned Indigenous Women and French Men. She also has a new book out, Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest. But really looking at the women that are marrying the men of the fur trade, and often, because the men would die first, inheriting then those posts, creating their own networks through adoption, through as they convert to Catholicism, godparenting, but really becoming strong economic actors in the territory that we might think of as Southern Ontario, Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana. So I would recommend you to her work, but above and beyond that, it gets to like in my own nation, one of the teachings that we have is that a lodge has a male side and a female side, and that without one of those sides, the lodge can't stand, right? You have to have both. And so it's also this sense of balance that, you know, each partner is going out and bringing, you know, really important products back to the family. Those products belong to the person who harvested them. And, you know, we see, and, you know, across North America, Indigenous people are puzzled by the lack of women at important discussions. Some Cherokee leaders actually go to a conference in North Carolina, you know, with the legislature, and they look around the legislature and they're like, where are the women? How can you make a decision without the women? I don't understand. So it's rather than being something that's surprising, it's commonplace in Indigenous North America that, you know, women have that authority. If you are the one that controls the stores of wild rice and the stores of dried corn, and this bunch of yahoos over here wants to go on a war party, you have the right to say, well, that's nice. I'm not giving you any rice. Have fun starving on your way over to Dakota Territory. So there's a lot of economic power within communities, in addition to the trade that comes with that agricultural responsibility and control. So I have Allison Conway is asking, can you describe a mode of historical investigation that gets away from print culture and draws on material objects instead? There's a methodology called ethnohistory. And, you know, as I often teach about that, it's the methodology I mostly use myself. And I often talk about interrogating the written record as a hostile witness, using knowledge from material culture and oral tradition and other sources to do that. Using you know, recognizing what the biases of the time are and trying to filter, all right, what is he saying through that bias? A kind of example is one of the missionaries whose papers I've worked with talks about, he has a daily diary that he keeps, and every time Midewin happens in the community, he complains about it to high heaven because you sing all night long at one point in that ceremony. So I was able to create a calendar of how often that community was continuing to practice Midewin in the presence of missionaries. So there are a lot of things we can still pull from that written record if we treat it as a hostile source, if we look for what they're not trying not to tell us or don't intend to tell us. But it's also about, when we think about ethnohistorical methods, that recognition that culture influences decisions and actions, right? And so to understand actions taken in the past, we have to understand the culture that shaped those decisions. You know, that goes into my question in the book that I wrote, Ogamog, was, all right, we can look at the treaties and we can see that Indigenous leaders reserved certain rights to hunt and fish in these territories. So how was leadership constructed and their understanding of their responsibilities framed that was the outcome, right? So really, you know, and there I dig into a lot of this, how is the land harvested? How is the land managed? Because that plays very tightly into what chiefs feel responsible for and the kinds of agreements that they enter into. So, you know, we can see some of that through material objects, certainly. You know, I think one of the things I mentioned is the degree to which fabric was desired by Indigenous women. They're also purchasing beads. And we have beautiful pieces of clothing that Indigenous women produce for themselves and their communities. So there's a lot that we can learn about their engagement with the trade because of those garments that we have in our museums or in family collections. And Betty has a question. Do infectious diseases fit into, oh, it just bounced on me. There we go. Fit into the story of Indigenous agency that I'm presenting. So infectious diseases definitely play a role. I mentioned the Mourning Wars, the Iroquois Mourning Wars. That's kind of understood as being the result of a wave of smallpox that comes through. The cultural expectation is that you replace the dead, and you replace the dead either through abducting someone and literally adopting them to take that person's place. If you think about the way that gift exchange works and the way that developing wealth through building relationships works, each person ends up at the center of a web of exchange and obligation. So, let's say Catherine and I at some point had become in a relationship of exchange and obligation, either because there's a marriage tie between our two families in some way, or our communities are allied in some way. But if over here in my backwoods the berry bushes fail, I would be able to go to Catherine and say, Catherine, our berry bushes failed. I can bring you this beautiful garment with all these beads on it that I made. Do you have some berries you could share with me so that I have some in my stores this year? So it becomes this gift exchange. And there's a certain level on which, and you see this throughout the historical record, it's almost considered what Indigenous people would see as a natural right is a right to eat. So when one of your allies comes to you and says, our crop was destroyed in one way or another, there is an enormous obligation to help them. And you even see this coming to the point with, where the fur trade comes in. Yes, you can trap here on our territory. You should eat all the meat that you want, but you have to give us the furs because that's our resource. So there are various ways that that's understood, but that's what we see expressed then, right, in these treaties, is that natural right to eat from the land. I may have gone off topic there. Disease. So where does disease comes in? It comes in with the Mourning Wars. You have to replace that person at the center of a network of exchange. Otherwise, you have a hole in your web. It comes in terms of, at times, destabilizing strength relationships between nations. So do the Iroquois attack the Huron because they are both Iroquoian speaking peoples and they're preferential for adoption because of that? Or is it because the Huron have become weakened by the onslaught of disease? That's a question that's very difficult from us at this historical moment to answer. But disease certainly plays a role, and it's much clearer in the New England colonies where we have the settlement starting almost 100 years earlier, to see the destabilization between nations, the relationship between the Pequots and the Narragansetts and so forth that get upset as a result of various waves of disease. So it does play a role, but I would say even when disease is present, Indigenous people are demanding the right to their sovereignty, demanding a recognition of their territories. You do end up sometimes with nations merging together as a result of loss from disease, but they're still then saying, this is our land. So it plays a role in the history, but I don't think it undermines the agency and the goals and drives that Indigenous people are pursuing. Let's see. Oh, and then just another thank you. Any other questions that I can help with?
So this might be a perfect moment to pause then, since we are a little bit over time. But you've just made an incredible, sort of first plenary talk. It's going to be a hard act to follow. And I just wanted to thank you again so much for speaking to us tonight, and to everyone for coming and staying till the end of our programming today. This concludes the first full day of the conference program. And yes, please, a round of applause again for this first plenary talk. And thanks again.
And thanks to all of you for the gift of spending your time with me and with what I had to present. So fabulous. Have a good evening, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.